In 1914, Austria and Germany stood alone in the defense of Western civilization against France, which had increasingly become a haven for socialism, and against the British Empire, the spreader of liberalism in the world. They stood for what had traditionally been Western civilization: Christianity, authority, monarchy, true culture. Tsarist Russia would fight on the wrong side of the war and pay for it dearly in the 20th century. In 1918, the fate of the West was truly sealed. But why then did only Austria and Germany fight for the preservation of Western civilization?
Eine eiserne Zeit, Jugend, Stahl und Eisen geweiht, unser Leben für Deutschland ein Flammenfanal, Jugend wir auf Eisen und Stahl.
So, firstly, to set up some premises. Why do I say the West ended in 1918 and not say 1945? Well, firstly, because that Second World War was really just a continuation of the first in very many ways. It was a stubborn refusal of the German people to acknowledge that they had lost the First War, and that their ideas were in decline, and that this century would belong to socialism and liberalism. And really, everything in that war is a refighting in slightly different ideological molds of the First War. And the First World War was really, in my view, about the traditional order, the traditional society. Like I say, monarchy and religion and hierarchy and a class society against the new forces of socialism and liberalism. Liberalism would in the end win in the 20th century and develop itself into neoliberalism, which is the most dominant ideology today. No matter what social justice and so on it claims, true socialism is not really the dominant force. They have some cultural power, but economically, politically, neoliberalism is the ruling world power. So the First World War is really when everything started in its decline. The Roaring Twenties are already a very rapid degeneration of culture. Jazz is introduced, modernist art, cubism is introduced, these sorts of things. Art would never really recover. Figurative art lost its prominent place. Atonal music started developing. The classical concertos and so on lost their place. And always, after the First World War, art started declining. The only example I could think of genuine Western art, an attempt to continue the pre-First World War art, is Art Nouveau, Rococo, but those were very short-lived and would be replaced by the likes of Bauhaus and Brutalism very rapidly. One thing I want to address in this video here is that why did the Netherlands not fight with Germany? Well, partially it's geopolitically, partially it's cultural. We were, after 1814, after Napoleon was defeated and the new order of Europe was established, we had a quite authoritarian monarch, William I. And he would, throughout his life, oppose constitutionalism and liberalism and try to preserve an authoritarian monarchy with very strong Calvinist roots. It's the reason the Netherlands split up into Belgium and the Netherlands, because after Napoleon it had been one country, Duitsland, as it should be. But there were too many religious and economic differences, and the authoritarian spirit of the king on one hand did not help, and on the other hand he was not a strong enough king to impose his will on the whole country. But I think that if the ideas of Willem I would have prevailed, we would have fought on the side of the Germans during the First World War. We were a very Germanicized, we were a part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Netherlands is of course a very Germanic culture. You could very much argue that Dutch is just a dialect of German. Platdiets is very, very similar to it. Frisian is spoken on both sides of the border, etc. And the Calvinist paternalist authoritarian ideology that was predominant in the Netherlands, well, up until the First World War, was quite supportive of monarchy and authoritarian paternalistic rule. The problem was that by 1914 the country had been split culturally among liberal forces, which were much more inclined to side with the British Empire, and the traditional paternalist Calvinist forces, who, though sympathetic with Germany, were not inclined for war, and really, if we could avoid war, we would have preferred to do so. However, what would have happened if we had participated in the World War? During the First World War, the Netherlands mobilized 400,000 soldiers to guard our borders and to ensure our neutrality. Had we sided with Germany, those 400,000 troops, whether that would be 1914, 1916 or 1917, could have been decisive in the campaigns in Belgium. At the Battle of Sedan, they would have provided sufficient manpower to break through to Paris. At the Somme, they would have provided sufficient manpower to break the British. And at the spring offensives, they would have provided sufficient support to the Germans to continue the offensive towards Paris before the Americans would have arrived. We did not, however. As I said, we were too culturally split and we had become too liberalized. And our conservative forces, which have never been very strong in the Netherlands, because we have a long Republican tradition, and have always had less of an inclination towards absolute authority as the Germans and especially the Prussians had, which there are many theories in this. There's the geographical theory, such as Carl Schmitt, who wrote about the ideas of sea peoples and land peoples, wherein land peoples who are at constant war with their neighbors have an inclination towards more authority, whereas sea peoples living on the coast, dependent on trade, who travel more and see more, are more inclined towards a more liberal worldview. At any rate, we did not partake in the war. And we did not partake in the Second War either. There were some volunteers, but you couldn't say that we really fought for tradition. And I would not like to see that happen again. This is one of the reasons I am a pan-Germanic nationalist, because I think we kind of let our side down in both world wars, but especially the First World War being the most relevant one. We should have fought on the side of Germany, even if it cost us what we had on our colonies in Indonesia, because, well, it destroyed the West. Britain won, but what did Britain really win? Both world wars, what did Britain really win? The Second World War, they lost their empire and supposedly fought for Poland, only to see Poland handed over to the Soviets. In the First World War, the balance of power, because of their indebtedness to the Americans, started shifting towards America, a process which was concluded in the Second World War. And really, they won practically nothing, because what would have happened if Germany had won the war? France might have been restored to a monarchy. There would have been some territorial annexations in the east. Austria-Hungary would have been preserved. Basically, the old order would have been preserved. The monarchies would have been preserved. Now, you can argue for or against monarchy. That isn't really the point here. The main point is that a transition towards modernity under monarchy would have been much better to preserve our civilization, because the abrupt shock end to all of our traditional institutions and values caused all the problems of the 20th century. It enabled the Bolsheviks to rise in Russia, Hungary, Germany, and win in Russia, of course. Liberalism started becoming untied from peoples and developing into just voracious, soulless capitalism, which as it exists today. So all in all, it would have been much better if Germany had won the First World War, and in some other ways, through meta-political and cultural shifts, we would have slowly morphed into modernity with modern technology, been more able to adapt to it, and have preserved quite a lot of what it is to be European, because what it is to be European today has been almost forgotten by the mass of the people, and our culture is in very severe decline. Artistically, in terms of ideas, in its philosophy, in its worldview. And we would have prevented all the guilt from the Second World War as well, because it would have never have happened. Therefore, I think, as Dutchmen, we should always remember that we should have stood with Germany.